Welcome back to JFM Wrestling, in association with my gaming channel. Today I'm bringing you the history of pro wrestling games on the Super Nintendo Entertainment System. So in no particular order, let's take a look at these 9 games. WCW Super Brawl Wrestling, made in 1994 by developer FCI. It was the only WCW game to be released on the Super NES, and the last to be produced by FCI. The game opens with a quick trip to the WCW control room and a neat intro before heading to a weird character selection screen. Unfortunately, the graphics make the character models almost unrecognizable. Everyone from Rick Rude to Sting, Ric Flair to Barry Windham have unnaturally elongated limbs and what look to be melted faces. Vader looks like a guy you'd see at a local bowling alley. Scott Steiner's head looks like something a Simpsons animator would have drawn. While a player tries to decide which wrestler to choose, guys like Ron Simmons shout out randomly and shake uncontrollably. The 3/4 overhead view of the ring is a nice touch and really the only wrestling game like that on the system. Unfortunately, it's the game's best feature. There is no music to speak of. The controls are confusing and seem to be designed to annoy and make you throw your controller in a fit of rage. Aside from the finishers, all wrestlers' movesets are virtually identical regardless if you choose Ricky Steamboat or Rick Steiner. Trying to perform those moves at the right time feel virtually impossible. Here is the full roster: Barry Windham, Flying Brian Pillman, The Natural Dustin Rhodes, Johnny B. Bad, Nature Boy Ric Flair, Rick Rude, Rick Steiner, Ricky the Dragon Steamboat, Ron Simmons, Scott Steiner, Sting, and Vader. As a side note, a Sega Genesis version was planned but never released. Next, we're moving on to the 4 WWF games produced for the system. The first being WWF Super WrestleMania by LJN in 1992. Players could choose from single, tag team, or 4-on-4 Survivor Series matches. The addition of the traditional elimination matches improves the game in a big way. This marked the first time they could play this type of match. The wrestlers' likenesses aren't spot on, but are definitely an improvement, moving from 8-bit to 16-bit. The photos of the wrestlers on the select screens and various stills look good, and overall the graphics are solid. The controls are at times unresponsive, sluggish even, but this was early in the system's life cycle. The grappling is a button-mashing chore, but there was a bit of fun to be had here for sure. The Super NES's edition unfortunately doesn't have any signature moves for wrestlers. The roster consists of Hulk Hogan, Randy Savage, Ted DiBiase, Jake Roberts, The Undertaker, Sid Justice, the Legion of Doom members Animal and Hawk, and the natural disasters Typhoon and Earthquake. The next WWF game came a year later in 1993 by LJN and was WWF Royal Rumble. Beyond updating the roster, LJN improved the music, the overall sound, and the realism from Super WrestleMania. The graphics are slightly improved as well. So the roster of Mr. Perfect, Lex Luger, Ric Flair, Randy Savage, Bret Hart, The Undertaker, Shawn Michaels, Razor Ramon, Crush, Ted DiBiase, Yokozuna, and Tatanka look a bit more like the real thing. WWF Royal Rumble has much of the same controls as WWF Super WrestleMania. The most noticeable addition is the grapple meter, which lets you know how well the button mashing is going. Also, LJN did add back-end signature moves for each wrestler. An excellent and subtle addition is the ability to bump the referee. Once the ref is down, wrestlers are free to perform illegal moves like choking and eye gouging. That nice touch, along with wrestlers performing signature poses and gestures throughout the match, up the realism and level of fun. Match types give you a choice between a standard match, a 6-man tag, a brawl without the ref, a tournament, or yes, even the Royal Rumble. The 1994 edition of a WWF licensed game was WWF Raw by LJN. This may have been LJN's best efforts at a playable WWF game before giving way with the licensing rights in the future. The company built on the successes of the first two games and tweaked the formula to come up with a solid game. This entry offers the biggest variety in terms of match types. Players can jump into tag team matches, Survivor Series elimination matches, a 12-man Royal Rumble, as well as a match called a Bedlam match. The Bedlam match is a mix between a tornado tag team match where both partners can wrestle at the same time and both need to be pinned or submitted to lose. You can also set yourself up in a handicap match with the Raw Endurance Match feature. WWF Raw's roster boasts the names of Shawn Michaels, Bret and Owen Hart, The Undertaker, Bam Bam Bigelow, Diesel, Doink the Clown, Kwang, Lex Luger, The Undertaker, Razor Ramon, the 1-2-3 Kid, and as a bonus, Luna Vachon, who will get right in there and fight with the men. The graphics look nearly identical to WWF Royal Rumble and WWF Super WrestleMania. Unfortunately, wrestlers' avatars were not unique size-wise and all ended up looking to be about the same size no matter if you chose a big guy or not. Every wrestler has a unique move based on their real-life finishing move. They all need to be performed in specific positions when the targeted opponent is low on stamina. Definitely worth a nostalgia play at the very least. On to the final WWF game and perhaps the best on this list, if not top 2, 1995 WWF WrestleMania, the arcade game. This was not an LJN but rather made by Acclaimed. WWF WrestleMania, the arcade game, features the most realistic-looking characters of the Super NES options and one of the most unrealistic gameplay experiences. The wrestlers benefit from similar graphic technology that made Mortal Kombat's fighters look so real. Commentary is provided by Vince McMahon and Jerry the King Lawler, who also appear in the game sitting at the announcer's table to the right of the ring, and Howard Finkel welcoming players to WrestleMania at the start screen. Most complaints stem from the stripped-down wrestling that the game is built on. There are far more strikes than grappling moves, and the game includes supernatural moves. For example, Doink's hand enlarges and shocks his opponents. Undertaker does some soul-tossing maneuver. Surprisingly, this game had only 6 superstars to choose from. Your choices are Bret Hart, Undertaker, Lex Luger, Razor Ramon, Shawn Michaels, and Doink the Clown. That's it. A unique feature is that each character can bleed an object that represents them. Such bleeding objects include dumbbells flying out of Lex Luger and Valentine hearts coming out of Bret Hart. WWF WrestleMania, the arcade game, features 2 single-player modes, the Intercontinental Championship and the WWF Championship. There are 2 multiplayer modes. Head-to-head, a one-on-one match between 2 players, or cooperative, where the 2 players team up in a tag team version of the WrestleMania challenge in which they must defeat the game's 8 wrestlers in groups of 2 to become the tag team champions. One neat trick is the avatar you chose could face off against the computer version of your wrestler, meaning you could have Undertaker versus Undertaker. To me, the real magic is how this mimics an actual arcade experience. I mean, it even says arcade in the name, so Acclaim understood the assignment. Of course, it was also an actual cabinet arcade game, so that helped too. A random Easter egg or fact about this game: shortly after the game was released, Midway executive Roger Sharp claimed that Atom Bomb appears in the game. Many years later, developer Sal DeVita confirmed that Atom Bomb was a hidden character, but also stated that the character in the game was not fully completed. Our next entry brings us to the non-licensed games, of which there are 4. The first is 1994's Hammerlock Wrestling, produced by Jalico. On aesthetics, credit Jalico for refusing to stick with the standard 2-dimensional side view of a ring. The result made for a delightful visual experience. Hammerlock Wrestling adds a close-up view of the action to the top and bottom of the screen. The division of the screen into 3 horizontal windows does make it a bit tougher to focus to me personally, as well as causing a bit of player movement limitation. Here, made-up wrestlers such as Great Max, Sam Warhammer, and Spud Marmoset are seen through an anime-inspired lens, using close-ups and slow motion. It adds a cinematic touch to the game, but for some players, it may be distracting to have so much going on. Match options include Exhibition, Champion League, Tournament, and Top Ranking Match, which is fighting everyone on the roster one at a time. The roster consists of 12 wrestlers that are loosely based off real wrestlers. They are Sam Warhammer, Mo Feudo, Ace Wagata, Ivan Destra, Great Max, Selvis Taquito, Spud Marmoset, Oga Prime, Alpha Bozak, Baron Kaiser, Sid Beanick, and Mondo Fundy. Had Hammerlock Wrestling come out in a year not overloaded with wrestling games, it might have received more attention. As it stands, there are much better games of the era that overshadow this one a bit. Next up is Capcom's 1994 Saturday Night Slam Masters. If you know, you know. The name of the game is probably appropriate for the time frame because in the early 90s Saturday night was wrestling night on the mothership. It was right about the time of this release that pendulum started swinging towards Mondays and Raw. This is probably not the most realistic wrestling game on this list, but as WWF WrestleMania, the arcade game showed, that wasn't a requirement to make an addictively playable wrestling game. Perhaps this akin to being the Street Fighter to WWF WrestleMania, the arcade game's Mortal Kombat. And the Street Fighter influence makes sense, considering Capcom made both games. The playable characters consist of Biff Slamkovich, Gumlock, Jumbo Flapjack, King Rastamon, The Great Oni, Titanic Tim, Alexander the Great, El Stingray, Mike Macho Hager, and the Scorpion, who is the final boss. As matches start, there are lasers that shoot down from the ceiling. Smoke billows up, the crowd roars. In many ways, the spectacle of WWF influenced this game. The graphics feature exaggerated bodies, and the graphics are okay if you aren't looking for a traditional wrestling game. As for movesets, each character has 2 special attacks, a non-grappling technique, and a finisher. When an opponent's life meter is depleted, he must either be pinned for a 3 count or forced to submit. Defeating all of the other wrestlers results in winning the championship belt, which must then be defended against the entire roster. And as for game modes, it's very simple, either a singles match and a team battle royale, where a player chooses a partner and team togethers and try to run the gauntlet against other generated tag teams. A little random fact about character Biff Slamkovich: when he loses, he makes a reference to Comrade Zangief from Street Fighter in his losing quote. Next up is Natsum Championship Wrestling, also released in 1994, and yes, this was produced by Natsum. While there are not a lot of fun bells and whistles to this game, it does boast an impressive variety of moves. The graphics aren't going to make this game for you. Also, the grappling system is a bit tricky to get into initially. It'll take at least a few matches before most players find they can master the many moves. Once you do, the experience can be quite enjoyable and is the game's best feature. Players can choose to play as Big Ape, Python, M. Roach, Hungry Snake, The Phantom, Fangs, K. Bruto, J. Cross, Conan, Asteroid, Spike, or the Viper. They will find out quickly that this isn't a game where one just smashes all the buttons and sees what happens. The player has a choice between an exhibition, a round-robin tournament, and a championship tournament, and these can be done as a single or a tag team. The computer seems to have the advantage far too often. Be prepared to do a ton of sticking and moving. In many ways, because of its challenging nature, Natsum Championship Wrestling feels like actual pro wrestling, very back and forth until you come from behind to claim victory. While this is not a licensed game, it's based off the Japanese version, which was. The Japanese version this game is widely based on a conversion of Zen Nippon Pro Wrestling - Sekai Saikyo Tag was an all-Japan wrestling license. On a side note, this game is now available on the Nintendo Switch online service under the Super Nintendo area. The last game on this list was never released in the US, but was such a popular import from Japan for the Super Nintendo that I felt the need to include it on this list. Super Fire Pro Wrestling Special. The game was released by Human Entertainment on December 22, 1994 for the Super Famicom, which of course was the Japanese version of the Super Nintendo system. One of the big draws of Fire Pro Wrestling has always been the series' expansive wrestling engine. Unlike other titles from this era, a timing-based grapple system. Players accustomed to button mashing will be in for a steep learning curve. Another huge draw, variety of characters. Super Fire Pro Wrestling Special contains a ridiculous 155 wrestlers, 75 regular characters, 30 unlockable characters, and 50 bonus templates. There is no shortage of match types either. The one-night match is the typical versus mode. Battle Royale offers 4 players to square off in the ring at the same time. Tournament and Open League modes allow players to organize traditional and round-robin tournaments. Champion Road is Special's story mode with several different scenario paths to take, and Edit mode is Special's robust Creator Wrestler suite. Major pros for this game include the incredibly in-depth Creator Wrestler mode, a solid soundtrack, and immersive story mode. With different scenario paths for added replay value, and the first wrestling game to feature a UFC-style octagon ring. 2 major things going against it. The menus are in Japanese, and honestly, this might not be as big of a con nowadays with the interconnectivity of the world. But Japanese releases aren't always the easiest to come by. Well, there we have it, a quick overview of all the pro wrestling games on the Super NES. Which one stood out to you? Any that you've played? And if so, what are your thoughts on them? Are these games nostalgic to you? Leave a comment below and let me know. Also, make sure you are subscribed here on JFM Wrestling and smash the like button. I'm also posting this to my gaming channel, so head to JFM Gaming, watch this video a second time, and subscribe over there as well. Until next time, JFM friends, live the wrestling life and game on.